She was 16 years old and she owned nothing in the world but a canvas satchel, a wool coat gone thin at the elbows, and $11 sewn into the hem of her petticoat. Her stepmother, a sharp-tongued woman named Agatha Vance who had married her father less than a year before his boat went down in a November squall, had told her plainly one gray morning that there was no more room at the table for a girl who wasn't blood. The house was sold within the month, the furniture carted off, and the girl was left standing on the frozen boardwalk of Thistle Bay, Maine, with the tide going out and nowhere particular to go. She spent $3 of her $11 on bread and a night's lodging above the chandlery, and with the rest, $9 counted twice with trembling fingers, she did something the whole town would later call foolish and some would call mad. She bought the old Stone Point light, condemned and dark for 6 years, sold at auction because no one else would touch it. Sold, the auctioneer said with a smirk, for scrap and spite. What she did not know, what no living soul in Thistle Bay knew, was that sealed behind the lamp room wall of that broken tower was a secret that would not only save her life but restore something the entire town had quietly grieved and never spoken of again. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Cordelia Ashworth, and the light she was never supposed to relight. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, a town too small for the map, a home too quiet, a life too overlooked, tell us in the comments because this story was written for you. Cordelia Ashworth had been born in the spring of 1881 in a shingled house 2 streets back from the Thistle Bay harbor, the only child of Josiah Ashworth, a quiet, careful man who made his living as a lensman, a repairer and polisher of the great glass prisms used in lighthouse lamps up and down the Maine coast. It was not a trade many understood, but it was a trade that mattered enormously, because a lighthouse without a true lens was worse than no lighthouse at all. It scattered its light instead of throwing it, and ships trusted scattered light at their peril. Josiah had learned the craft from an old keeper named Elias Bramwell, a man who had tended the Stone Point light for nearly 30 years and who had, in his retirement, taken young Josiah under his wing the way some men take in a stray dog, not out of obligation, but because something in the boy's careful hands and quiet patience reminded him of himself. Cordelia grew up hearing Bramwell's name spoken with a kind of reverence in her father's workshop, a cramped room that smelled of linseed oil and brass polish, where broken lenses lay wrapped in flannel like sleeping children waiting to be mended. Her father taught her to see with her hands as much as her eyes, to feel for the hairline crack in a prism before it caught the light wrong, to grind glass slowly and patiently until it was true, to tie a bowline and a sheet bend and a rolling hitch until her fingers could do it in the dark. "A lens doesn't lie, Cordy," he used to tell her, turning a piece of glass so it threw a rainbow across the workshop floor. "It only shows you what's really there. People are the ones who bend the light." Her mother had died of a fever when Cordelia was 4, and she remembered her only as a warmth and a smell of lavender water, so it was her father who raised her, and raised her well, teaching her not only his trade but his temperament, a steadiness, a refusal to panic, a belief that most things broken could be mended by someone patient enough to try. When she was 9, Josiah married Agatha Pruitt, a widow from Bangor with a sharp chin and a sharper eye for money, and though Cordelia tried for years to love her as a mother, Agatha made it clear in 100 small ways that she considered the girl an inconvenience attached to an otherwise acceptable husband. Josiah, gentle to a fault, never seemed to notice, or perhaps noticed and simply hoped it would soften with time. It did not. What Cordelia held on to through the cold suppers and the colder silences was her father's workshop, and the stories he told her there, especially the stories of old Elias Bramwell, who had kept the Stone Point light faithfully for 3 decades until one terrible night in 1884 when, depending on who told it, he had either drowned trying to save a foundering fishing crew, or vanished with a portion of the town's mutual aid fund, which had been entrusted to his care as the most trusted and least corruptible man in Thistle Bay. Josiah never believed the second story. Elias Bramwell wouldn't have stolen a penny if his life depended on it, he told Cordelia more than once, his voice low and certain in the way it only got when he meant something all the way through. There's more to that story than anyone's told. But Josiah never lived to chase the truth of it, because 6 years after Bramwell's disappearance, Josiah Ashworth's own boat, borrowed for a Sunday of mackerel fishing with 2 other men from the harbor, was caught in a fast-moving squall 3 miles offshore, and none of the 3 came home. The fall came quickly after that, the way water finds every low place in a house all at once. Agatha, who had never had much patience for her stepdaughter, had even less for the burden of raising a girl alone on a widow's thin means, and within weeks she had accepted a proposal from a merchant in Bangor who wanted a wife but had made it privately, unmistakably clear that he did not want another man's child underfoot. Agatha sold the Ashworth house, Cordelia's house, her father's workshop, the room where she had learned to grind glass and tie knots and believe that broken things were worth mending, to a fish merchant expanding his smokehouse, and she gave Cordelia 3 days' notice and a small purse that Cordelia would later discover held exactly $11, which Agatha seemed to regard as generous. "You're 16, Agatha told her, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if she had been cruel. "Old enough to make your own way. Your father would want you to be independent." Cordelia did not argue. There was no one to argue to. She packed what little was hers into a canvas satchel, her father's smallest lens-grinding tools wrapped in flannel, a photograph of her mother she barely remembered, 3 books, and the coat on her back, and she walked out of the only house she had ever known with her chin up and her stomach hollow, because crying, she had decided somewhere on the second sleepless night, was a luxury for people who still had somewhere to cry to. She spent 2 nights above the chandlery, paying a widow named Mrs. Petrie 50 cents a night for a cot in the storeroom, and she spent those nights doing arithmetic in her head that never came out any better no matter how many times she ran the numbers. $9, once lodging and bread were subtracted, was not enough to rent a room for more than a few weeks, and no employer in Thistle Bay was eager to hire a 16-year-old orphan girl with no trade a woman was permitted to practice and no family name to yuch for her character. She walked the harbor road on the 3rd morning, watching the gulls wheel over the fish stalls, and it was there, pinned to the post outside the county clerk's office, that she saw the auction notice. The old Stone Point light, condemned by the Lighthouse Board in 1890, decommissioned and sold as private property after a newer, automated light was built 2 miles up the point to replace it, to be auctioned for back taxes owed on the parcel, no reserve, sold as is. Cordelia had walked past that lighthouse her entire childhood without truly looking at it. A gray stone tower on a spit of rock at the harbor's mouth, its lantern room dark, its door boarded, its keeper's cottage sagging into the sea grass. But she remembered, suddenly and vividly, standing in her father's workshop as a small girl while he told her that Stone Point had been Elias Bramwell's light, the one he'd kept faithfully for 30 years before the terrible night that ended everything. The auction was a small, cold affair held on the courthouse steps, attended mostly by men looking for stone to salvage and one lumber merchant who wanted the land for a timber landing. The auctioneer, a portly man named Huxtable, ran through the property description in a bored monotone: condemned structure, no habitable dwelling, hazard of collapse, sold as is with no warranty, and when no one bid above $4, he looked out at the thin crowd with open contempt and said the whole lot, tower, cottage and rocky spit, would go for scrap and spite, to whoever wanted to waste their money on it. Cordelia had $9 remaining. She raised her hand and said in a voice steadier than she felt, $9, and the crowd laughed, not cruelly exactly, but the way people laugh at something that confirms what they already believed about the world. Huxtable looked at her, a girl in a thin coat, alone, red-eyed from 3 sleepless nights, and something in his face flickered toward pity before he brought the gavel down. "Sold," he said, to the young lady for $9 and God help her. The men around her chuckled and drifted off toward the tavern, already forgetting the strange, small transaction, and Cordelia Ashworth walked down to the harbor's edge that same afternoon, deed in her satchel, to look at the ruin she now owned outright, thinking that whatever else had been taken from her, no one could take this. The tower was worse up close than it had looked from the road. 6 years of salt wind had stripped most of the whitewash from the stone, the iron gallery railing at the top was rusted through in places, and the heavy oak door hung crooked on one hinge, swollen shut with damp. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a pry bar borrowed from Mrs. Petrie, to force the door open enough to slip inside, and when she did, the air that met her was cold and close and smelled of dust and old salt and something faintly like beeswax, as though a candle had been snuffed there only recently rather than years before. The ground floor held the ruins of a keeper's stores room, empty oil casks, a rusted stove, a single overturned chair, and a narrow iron staircase spiraling up into darkness. She climbed it slowly, one hand on the cold rail, counting the steps the way her father had taught her to count anything that frightened her, and at the top she came out into the lamp room itself, ringed with glass panes, half of them cracked. The great lens that should have crowned it long since removed and sold off by the Lighthouse Board when the light was decommissioned. What remained was an empty brass pedestal where the lens had once stood, and around it, a small keeper's room with a narrow cot frame, a writing desk swollen with damp, and on the curved inner wall behind where the desk had once stood, a section of wood paneling that did not quite match the stone around it, paneling that, when Cordelia laid her palm flat against it out of nothing more than idle curiosity, sounded hollow beneath her hand in a way that stone never does. She almost didn't investigate it that first evening. The light was failing and she had nowhere warm to sleep and a great deal to think about, and a hollow-sounding wall in a condemned lighthouse seemed reasonably like the least of her problems. But something in her father's voice perhaps telling her that a thing that sounds hollow is a thing worth asking questions of, made her run her fingers along the edge of the paneling until she found, near the bottom corner, a seam that gave slightly under pressure. She worked at it with the pry bar until, with a groan of old wood, an entire panel swung outward on a hidden hinge, revealing a shallow cavity built into the thickness of the stone wall itself, the kind of space a careful man might build slowly over years, telling no one, for a purpose he considered sacred. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, she found a wooden strongbox, and beside it, a bundle of letters tied with tarred twine, and a leather-bound ledger whose cover, when she wiped the dust away with her sleeve, bore a single name stamped in faded gold, E. Bramwell. Her hands were shaking as she carried the box and the ledger down to the ground floor, where the last gray light still came through the broken door, and she sat on the overturned chair and opened the ledger first, because it seemed the safer of the two mysteries. What she found inside were columns of names, nearly every family name in Thistle Bay, the Petrys and the Dohertys and the Vances and dozens more, each with a figure beside it, small sums $2 here, $5 there, contributed over years, and she understood, reading the careful, cramped handwriting, that this was the ledger of the Thistle Bay Mutual Aid Society, a fund the fishing families had built together over a decade to help widows and injured men in bad seasons, a fund that had vanished, along with its keeper, on the same terrible night in 1884 that had made Elias Bramwell's name a whispered accusation in every tavern on the harbor. The last entry in the ledger, dated the night before the storm, was not a deposit but a note, written in a hand grown suddenly urgent. Pruitt has asked again to hold the fund at the bank for safekeeping. I will not give it to him. He means to use it for his own dock scheme and call it a loan he never repays. I will keep it here until the society can appoint an honest treasurer. God forgive me if I am wrong to distrust him, but I have seen his ledgers and I do not. Cordelia sat very still in the failing light, the ledger open on her knees, and felt the whole shape of a story rearrange itself in her mind. Pruitt. Her stepmother's family name. She had never thought to ask in all her father's stories, whether Agatha's people and the Silas Pruitt who had, by the time Cordelia was born, become the most powerful banker in Thistle Bay, were one and the same, but she remembered now, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold stone around her, that Agatha had always spoken of my cousin Silas, with a pride she reserved for nothing else in her life. She untied the bundle of letters next, and these were not a ledger's cold arithmetic but a man's private voice, written across what must have been the final months of Elias Bramwell's tenure at the Light, addressed to no one in particular, the way a man writes when he suspects he may not live to send his letters and wants, at least, to leave the truth somewhere it might be found. Bramwell wrote of Silas Pruitt's growing pressure to move the society's fund into the bank's keeping, of Pruitt's plans for a private timber dock that would enrich himself while claiming to serve the town, of Bramwell's quiet refusal and his fear that Pruitt, thwarted, would find some way to discredit him. And in the last letter, dated the very night of the storm, Bramwell wrote of seeing lantern signals from a fishing boat in distress off Widow's Ledge, of going out alone in the Light's small dory because there was no time to raise the harbor, of not being certain, as he sealed this letter into the wall before he left, that he would return to unseal it himself. If I do not come back, the letter ended, let whoever finds this know that I did not run and I did not steal. The fund is here, every dollar of it safe behind this wall, meant for the society and no one else. I only ask that whoever reads this see that it reaches the people it was meant for, and that my name, whatever else becomes of it, not be made a thief's name for a crime I never committed. The strongbox, when Cordelia finally opened it with hands that would not quite stop trembling, held gold and silver coin wrapped in cloth, sums that would have been a fortune to a fishing family in 1884 and remained, even now, a small fortune to a girl who owned $9 and a condemned lighthouse. But it was not the money that made her sit on that cold floor and weep for the first time since her father died. It was the understanding that Elias Bramwell, the man her father had loved and defended and never stopped believing in, had died that night not as a thief but as exactly the man Josiah always said he was, and that the truth of it had been sealed in a wall for 13 years, waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough, and with nothing left to lose, to come looking. Cordelia did not sleep that night or the next. She read every letter twice, cross-referenced every name in the ledger against families she still knew in Thistle Bay, and made a decision that surprised her with how little doubt attended it. She would not touch a dollar of that money for herself, not even to buy bread, not even to fix the door that would not properly close, because the moment she did, she would become exactly the kind of person Silas Pruitt had always assumed poor people secretly were. Instead, she spent her remaining coins on nails and rope and canvas to patch the worst of the lighthouse's wounds, moved her satchel and her cot into the dry corner of the store's room, and began, in the gray mornings before anyone in town was awake to see her, to clean and repair the tower with the same patient, careful hands her father had trained. Because if she was going to walk into the Thistle Bay Mutual Aid Society and tell them their vanished fund had been found, she wanted to walk in. As a woman who had proven, however quietly, that she could be trusted with something precious. It did not take long for word to spread that the orphaned Ashworth girl had bought the old light and moved into it, and less time still for that word to reach Silas Pruitt, who by then had built the Thistle Bay Savings Bank into the largest private fortune in 3 counties, largely, though few said it aloud, on the strength of loans and land deals that always seemed to leave him a little richer and his borrowers a little poorer. Pruitt was a tall, silvering man with a courteous manner and cold eyes, and when Cordelia came to him first before going to anyone else, to show him the ledger and ask how the society might be properly reconvened to receive its fund, he did something she had not expected. He smiled, warmly congratulated her on her remarkable find and then explained, with the patient tone of a man correcting a child's arithmetic, that the Mutual Aid Society had been formally dissolved in 1885, its charter lapsed, and that under the law an unclaimed fund of that age found on private property belonged now entirely to the property's owner, meaning of course to her, and that he would be delighted, as a gesture of neighborly goodwill, to help a young woman of no experience manage such a sudden and complicated windfall, beginning with depositing it safely at his bank. Cordelia understood, standing in the mahogany quiet of his office, that she was being offered a very old kind of trap dressed up as a kindness, and she understood too from Bramwell's own letters not 2 feet away in her satchel, exactly what Pruitt intended to do with the money once it was safely inside his vault. She thanked him, told him she would consider his generous offer, and walked out of the bank with her spine straight and her mind already working on a different plan entirely, because if the law said the fund belonged to whoever found it, then the law also could not stop her from simply giving it away. She spent the following weeks doing something Thistle Bay had never quite seen from a 16-year-old orphan girl. She went family by family to every name in Bramwell's ledger, sat at their kitchen tables, showed them the entry beside their own name, and told them the truth of what had happened to Elias Bramwell and to their money. Some wept. Some at first did not believe her, until she showed them Bramwell's letters and they recognized in his careful familiar hand, the writing of a man they had known and mourned and quietly disparaged for 13 years. Old Captain Doherty, who had lost his leg to a winch accident and been kept from ruin only by a society payment 2 years before the fund vanished, sat with the ledger on his knees and said nothing for a long while before finally saying, "I called that man a thief at my own supper table. I owe his memory an apology. I can't pay him any more." Cordelia told him gently that there was still a way to pay it, by helping her reconvene the society properly, this time with a charter that could never lapse into a single man's convenience again. Silas Pruitt did not sit quietly while a 16-year-old girl undid, family by family, the careful patience of 13 years. He went first to the county assessor to challenge the validity of Cordelia's auction purchase, arguing the sale had been improperly conducted. When that failed, because Huxtable, gruff as he was, kept scrupulous records and would not lie for a banker, Pruitt went instead to the town council, of which he was a leading member, and proposed an ordinance condemning the Stone Point light entirely as a public safety hazard, to be demolished for the good of the harbor, an ordinance that would, incidentally, remove both the girl and the wall that held the last physical proof of what he had tried to do in 1884. He spoke at the council meeting with practiced sorrow about the danger of a decaying tower to curious children, about the liability the town could not afford to bear, and several council members, who owed Pruitt's bank money on their boats or their homes, nodded along with the particular attentiveness of men who understood exactly what was being asked of them. Cordelia stood to speak at that meeting with Bramwell's ledger in one hand and his letters in the other, and she did not raise her voice, because her father had taught her that the truth rarely needs to be shouted to be heard by people willing to listen. She read them Bramwell's last letter, the one written the night he rowed out alone into a storm to save men who were not even his own crew, and she watched the room grow very quiet, because most of the people in it had known Elias Bramwell, had eaten fish he'd pulled from his own lines, had waved to him from the harbor road for 30 years, and had let a banker's convenient story replace their own memory of the man. She named Silas Pruitt's role plainly but without cruelty, laid the ledger's evidence beside his own bank records, which old Captain Doherty, it turned out, had quietly obtained through a cousin who clerked there, and asked only that the town allow her to reconvene the Mutual Aid Society under a proper charter, with a board of trustees drawn from the very families in the ledger, so that no single man could ever again hold the town's trust in one pair of hands. The vote, when it came, was not close. The demolition ordinance failed, and in its place the council, shamed, perhaps, or simply relieved to have an honorable path offered to them, voted to formally reinstate the Thistle Bay Mutual Aid Society, with the recovered fund as its founding capital, and to grant Cordelia Ashworth, in recognition of her discovery and her refusal to keep a single dollar of it for herself, formal title to the Stone Point Light as a private residence exempt from the demolition question entirely. Silas Pruitt left the meeting without a word, his face the color of old paper, and though he remained a banker in Thistle Bay for some years afterward, he was never again invited to sit on the society's board, and men who had once deferred to him at the tavern found, in small quiet ways, that his word no longer carried the weight it once had. What Cordelia did next surprised the town more than anything that had come before, because instead of simply handing the fund over and stepping back into obscurity, she asked the newly formed society for one thing in return for her honesty: the right to become the official keeper of the Stone Point Light. The Lighthouse Board, when petitioned, was reluctant at first to license a woman, and a young one at that, but Captain Doherty and a dozen others, men whose fathers and grandfathers Bramwell had guided safely to harbor for 30 years, wrote letters on her behalf, and the board relented, perhaps because it was cheaper to license an eager local keeper than to maintain the point's automated light, which had never worked reliably in fog the way the old lens had. Cordelia used a portion of her own labor and the goodwill of a town that finally understood what she had done for them, to have a new Fresnel lens installed in the empty brass pedestal where the old one had stood, ground and set with the same patient care her father had taught her in his workshop years before, and on a clear October evening in 1897, not yet a year after she had stood alone on the harbor road with $9 and nowhere to go, Cordelia Ashworth lit the Stone Point Light for the first time in 13 years and stood on the gallery railing watching its beams sweep out across the dark water, thinking of a lensman's daughter and a keeper who had drowned rather than betray a town's trust, and feeling, for the first time since her father's boat went down, that she was standing exactly where she belonged. She was 16 years old, and she had owned nothing in the world but a canvas satchel and $9 and a debt of faith her father had left her without ever meaning to. She had bought a broken lighthouse that the whole town called a fool's purchase, sold for scrap and spite on a cold courthouse step, and what she found sealed behind its wall was not merely gold, though there was gold, and not merely a secret, though there was a secret 13 years buried. It was the truth of a good man's name, and the means to give a wronged town back its trust in itself. Cordelia Ashworth did not restore the Stone Point Light because she wanted glory, and she did not clear Elias Bramwell's name because it profited her to do so. She did it because her father had taught her that a lens does not lie, that it only shows you what is truly there, and that the people around it are the ones who choose whether to bend the light or let it shine true. She chose, every single time it would have been easier not to let it shine true, and in doing so she became, in a town that had once dismissed her as a friendless orphan with nowhere left to go, the keeper not only of a lighthouse but of something far harder to relight once it has gone dark, a community's belief in itself. Thank you for spending this time with Cordelia's story and with us. If a piece of this found its way into you tonight, we hope you'll consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things, and overlooked people, are so often worth a second, patient look. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? We read every story you leave us and they mean more than you know. Until next time, stay close, keep your own light burning however small it feels tonight, and we'll see you in the next story.